We continue now at the top of Daf Nun Aleph Amid Beis Meseches Sanhedrin. This is Sanhedrin Daf 51b. The Gemara is trying to understand what does Rabbi Eliezer mean in the Brisa when he says Es Aviha. It's talking about a Bas Kohen with her father is Bisreifa, gets the punishment of Sreifa, and Es Chameha with her father-in-law, it's Beskila with stoning. And the Gemara now brings the following answer, Liolam Rabbi Yishmael. Really, Rabbi Eliezer in the Brisa is following Rabbi Yishmael. V'hachi Kamar, and this is what the Brisa is saying. Es Avia, when the Brisa says that the daughter of the Kohen is Es Avia, that actually means Bereshus Avia. That means if she's still in the Reshus of her father, it just means to say that she's an Arusa, she's betrothed. So if you have a Bas Kohen Arusa who commits adultery, according to Rabbi Yishmael, that's Bisreifa. She's going to get a punishment of Sreifa. Now the problem is, if that's how you're going to interpret that, so how do you understand Es Chameh? Es Chameh presumably would mean Bereshus. In the Reshus of her father-in-law, she's a Nesua, but according to Rabbi Yishmael, a Nesua Bas Kohen does not get Skila, and so now he interprets that line slightly differently. V'es chameh, when it says es chameh, it actually means mei chameh. If she has relations with her father-in-law, then beskila, then she gets skila. V'chol adam b'chenek, but again, according to Rabbi Yishmael, if she would be a nesua and she would have commit adultery with any other person, then she would have a punishment of chenek, according to Rabbi Yishmael, the punishment of strangulation. But the Gemara says, Amar Rava, Rava says on this answer, it's not a good answer. Ma'ishna, what's the difference that the first part, es avia, you interpret that bereshus avia, and es chameha, you interpret that mei chameha. Oh, idi v'idi mamish, either each part of the phrase means she's actually having relations with that person. Oh, idi v'idi reshus, or you should interpret each part is that we're talking under the authority of her father, under the authority of her father-in-law. And so the Gemara instead gives another explanation of Rabbi Eliezer. Elamar Rava, rather, Rava says, liolam Rabbi Shimon. Really, Rabbi Eliezer is following Rabbi Shimon. Now, the problem with Rabbi Shimon is, Rabbi Shimon holds it doesn't matter if she's an Arusa Bas Kohen or a Nesua Bas Kohen, it's always Sreifa. But the Gemara gives a slightly alternate explanation within Rabbi Eliezer. Because Rabbi Eliezer holds within Rabbi Shimon that Nesua Ka'arusa, that you treat a Nesua like an Arusa. Meaning, ma arusa chad darga, just like by an arusa, if she's a Bas Kohen arusa who commits adultery, she goes up one level in punishment. Meaning, maskinan la miskila l'sreifa. If she'd be a Bas Yisrael, she'd get skila, and we raise her up and give her the higher punishment of sreifa, because again, according to Rabbi Shimon, sreifa is stricter than skila. So af nesua, so Rabbi Eliezer is saying, by a nesua, the same thing is true. By a Bas Kohen nesua, so chad darga maskinan la, we bring her up one level. A nesua Bas Yisrael would be chenek, would be strangulation, and we bring her up mechenek, we bring her up from chenek to skila, because again, according to Rabbi Shimon, skila is right above chenek in terms of its severity. But the Gemara asks on this answer, Maskef la Rabbi Chanina. Rabbi Chanina asks on this, Ha'idi v'idi Rabbi Shimon b'sreifa kamer. But we know that Rabbi Shimon himself said both nesua and arusa they get sreifa. So how can we say this answer within Rabbi Eliezer? Elam Ravina, rather Ravina says the following answer: Liolam kerabanan. Really, we're following the Rabbanan. Now the problem is, if we're following the Rabbanan would say that a Bas Kohen, we would say Arusa, in a situation of an Arusa Bas Kohen, she actually would get skila. And in a situation of a Nesua, that's where she would get sreifa. That's exactly the opposite. If you're going to interpret when it says Avia, it means Bereshus Avia. That would mean she's an Arusa. She's getting sreifa. That's the opposite. Again, the Arusa, according to the Rabbanan, is really getting skila. And so the Gemara says that's exactly what it really should have said. V'epach, you have to reverse it. Es Avia b'skila. If she's under the Reshus of her father, she's going to get skila. She's an Arusa, she gets skila by Bas Kohen. V'es chamen, if she's under the Reshus of her father-in-law, meaning she's a Nesua Bas Kohen who commits adultery, Bisreifa, she's going to get Sreifa. And the Gemara just notes, V'haide ko'amar es avia. Now the reason why we use this strange language of es avia, why not simply say she's an Arusa? Sircha bi'almanakat, they're just using the common wording, the way that people generally phrase it when they talk. That's how the Brisa words it. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rabba bar Avu, Amar Rav. Rav Nachman says that Rabba bar Avu says that Rav says, Halacha k'desholach Rav in Mishmei Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina. The halacha is like Rav sent in the name of Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina. This is referring to the first explanation of what Rabbi Eliezer meant in the Brisa. At the very top of the page when we said Liolam Rabbi Yishmael, that was the second explanation being given. That was the explanation of Rabbi Yirmiyah, because Rabbi Yirmiyah questioned that first explanation. And so now we're quoting from Rav that the halacha is like the first explanation of Rabbi Eliezer. Again, that's on the previous Amud, the answer that Ravin sent in the name of Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Chanina. But the Gemara continues, Amar Rabbi Yosef says, Hilchas al Mashiach, you're giving a halacha for the times of Mashiach. All of this has to do with the death penalty, which doesn't even apply nowadays. Why are we paskening in a situation that's not going to apply until Mashiach comes? Amar le Abaye said to Rabbi Yosef, Elameat, according to that, if you're going to ask that question, Shchitas Kachim lo lisni, we shouldn't learn anything about Shechting Kachim, about Karbanos. Hilchas al Mashiach, because are we learning halachas that have to do with when Mashiach comes. Ela Drosh v'kabel schar. Obviously, there's a idea of darshaning, of learning, in order to receive reward, even if it doesn't apply. Hachanami Drosh v'kabel schar. So too over here, he's saying that the halacha is like this first answer. Again, it's an idea of Drosh v'kabel schar. But the Gemara continues that Rav Yosef responded, Hachi Kamri, this is what I was saying. Hilchas alamali, why are you phrasing it that the halacha is like this first answer of Rav in Mishmeid Rav Yosef Rabbi Chanina, Sugya Deshmaita halacha ka'amar. It's just a Sugya Deshmaita, meaning to say, it's just an explanation of what Rabbi Eliezer means. We had a number of explanations of how to understand Rabbi Eliezer. It's not an issue of who we paskin like. That was my question of why does it say over here, halacha, that the halacha is like the first answer, when it's not an issue of paskening, it's just an issue of understanding what Rabbi Eliezer means. And Rashi explains, Hilchas al Mashiach, you're paskening a halacha for the times of Mashiach. Halacha zu k'sheyavo yemos ha-Mashiach, itzrich lanu sheyashuvu daled misas bezin lemekoman. This halacha is only needed when there's daled misas bezin at the times of Mashiach. Hachi ko'amina. So he said, no, this is what I meant. Halacha lamali sugya deshmaita halacha kamar. This is just a question of explaining how to explain Rabbi Eliezer. It's not a question of halacha. Bitmi, it's like a question. Mishayich l'meimer halacha b'chi hay machlokas. This machlokas of how to understand Rabbi Eliezer, you call that a halacha? She'ein bein Ravin l'Ravina. There's no real machlokas between Ravin and Ravina. Lo chiyav v'lo p'tor v'lo chiluk misa. There's no difference in terms of when you're chayiv, when you're potter, what kind of misa. The Tarvayim Mefarshi, both of them agree, Nesua b'sreifa, that if she's a bas kohen Nesua, the punishment is sreifa. And Arusa b'skila, if she's a bas kohen Arusa, she gets skila. Uvetikon lashon ha-braisa pligi, they're just asking how to understand the braisa. Mar misakin lo lelishna de lo itzrich lafucha, one understands you don't have to reverse things in order to understand it. Umar mapech lo mishum docha de lishna, one says you should reverse it because the language is difficult. Umay halacha ikalamemer b'sugi deshmaita, what kind of halachic ruling would you issue in a kind of situation like this? Acharei she'en anu lemeidin mimena klum, you're not learning anything. K'sheyavo ha-Mashiach v'yechaya ha-mesim, when Mashiach comes, that's why he phrased it as Hilchas al Mashiach. When Mashiach comes and we have Tchias ha-mesim, nishalas Rabbi Eliezer be'ezel lashon amar, then we can ask Rabbi Eliezer exactly what he meant. And the Gemara continues, my Rabbi Yishmael, what is the sheet of Rabbi Yishmael that we mentioned earlier? Again, Rabbi Yishmael, he says that this halacha, that when a bas kohen, when she commits adultery, she gets streifa, he specifically says that refers to a bas kohen who's an arusa, and when it comes to a bas kohen who's an asua, she actually gets punished with strangulation, with chenek. And the Gemara continues and brings the source for Rabbi Yishmael, the Tanya, as we learned in a brisa, ubasish kohen kisecha liznos benara v'hi arusa hakosim medaber. Again, it talks about the daughter of a kohen who commits adultery. We're talking specifically about a young girl who just entered adulthood, who is an arusa, who's betrothed. Ata omer benara v'hi arusa, you're saying that it's a nara who's betrothed. Oeino ela afila nesua, maybe it even means nesua, that she's married. Talmud Lomar, the pasuk says, "Ish asher yinafes eshes reyehu mos yumas hanoif vanoafes." It talks about the fact that again, when you have a person committing adultery, so then the noef and the noafes, the man and the woman involved in the adultery, they mos yumas, they surely will die. And so we understand as follows: Hakol hayu bechlal hanoef vanoafes. Everybody should be in the same rule in terms of adultery. Hotzi akasa bas Yisrael beskila. Now we know that when it comes to a bas Yisrael, so if she's a bas Yisrael who's a nara hamorasa, as we said, so then the punishment is actually skila. It's not the same as typical adultery of strangulation. Ubas kohen besreifa, and also we find that the daughter of a kohen, the same idea. There's an exception, and she's punished with streifa. And we understand as follows: Ma'kish hotzi akosov as bas Yisrael is skila arusa v'lo nesua. Just like when we say that a bas Yisrael who gets skila, that exception is specifically by a bas Yisrael who's an arusa, who is betrothed, not by a bas Yisrael who's nesua, who is married. Afkish hotzi akosov bas kohen l'sreifa. So too, when the pasuk says that a bas kohen is different and she gets the punishment of streifa, says Rabbi Yishmael arusa v'lo nesua. It's specifically by a woman who's betrothed. This exception does not apply to a woman who is married, again by the bas kohen. And the brisa continues, Zomameho uvoala. Now when it comes to, let's say, Adam Zomamin involved in such a case, or Boala, that's the person, the man that she commits the adultery with, Bechlal v'asisam lo kasher zamam. They're all included in the punishment of you do to them what they tried to do. The Gemara said that the Gemara now says that last line, it doesn't make any sense. Boala, my kasher zamam ika. The person she's committing adultery with, what kasher zamam? He's not trying to do anything, he's actually committing the avera. Ella, rather, what that last line means to say is as follows. Zomameh, if you have Adam Zomamin, let's say in a case of Bas Kohen who's getting Sreifa, Bechlal Misas Boala. So they're not going to get Sreifa, those Adam Zomamin. If it turns out they were false witnesses, they're not going to get Sreifa because they get what they were trying to do to him and not what they're trying to do to her. Mishum shenemar, because it says in the pasuk, "Va'asisem lo kasher zamam lasos la'achiv v'lo la'achos." So it's what they were trying to do to the brother and not the sister. It's what they were trying to do to the man and not the bas kohen, and therefore again they're going to be punished with chenek, with strangulation. Divrei Rabbi Yishmael. These are the words of Rabbi Yishmael. That's the first part of the brisa, and the brisa continues. Rabbi Akiva Omer. Rabbi Akiva says, "Achas arusa v'achas nesua yotzas l'sreifa." That this halacha of a bas kohen having a punishment of sreifa, it applies by both an arusa and an nesua. Yachol afilu pnuya. Now I might think it applies even by a bas kohen who's unmarried who has relations. Nemar kan avia. It says over here the word avia when it talks about a bas kohen. V'nemar lahalon avia, and it says further on avia, meaning to say by a regular situation of nara hamorasa bas Yisrael that gets skila. It also uses the word avia. Malahalon znus imzekas habal. Just like over there, what we mean to say is nus that's taking place. There's some kind of a marriage going on, whether it be nesua or arusa. Afkan znus imzekas habal. So too over here, we're talking about znus imzekas habal. Again, Rabbi Akiva's shita is by bas kohen that it doesn't matter if it's arusa or nesua. That's why we're using the word zekas habal, because again, by bas kohen, it could be both arusa or nesua, as long as there's any kind of husband involved. And so again, the idea over here is that's what we learn from avia, according to Rabbi Akiva, to exclude penuya, but as long as there's some kind of zekas habal, so then we're going to say that there's a halacha of sreifa by the bas kohen. And the Gemara continues, Amar lo Rabbi Yishmael, Amar lo Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi Yishmael says to Rabbi Akiva, Ima lahalon nara v'harusa, but one second, if you're comparing it based on avia, you're making this gezerah shavet to the case of a nara hamorasa who's a bas Yisrael, so over there she's a nara and she's arusa, she's betrothed. Afkan nara v'harusa, so to over here, shouldn't it only be by an arusa? Why are you including even a nesua? Amar lo Rabbi Akiva, so Rabbi Akiva said to Rabbi Yishmael, Yishmael achi, Yishmael my brother, bas ubas ani doresh. It uses, there's an extra vav, it doesn't say bas, it says ubas, and therefore I darshan from the extra vav to include even an asua. Amar lo, so Rabbi Yishmael says back to Rabbi Akiva, v'chim mipneisha tadoresh bas ubas, just because you make this drasha of the word ubas, notzi zula sreifa, that's the reason why we should say now that the nesua should get the stricter punishment of sreifa. Imashma lohavi es hanesua, and if you're saying that that drasha is enough to include a nesua, hey v'es hapnuya, why not use that drasha to include an unmarried girl as well to get the punishment of sreifa by a bas kohen? V'imashma lohotzi es hapnuya, hotzi es hanesua, and if you're excluding penuya, you should exclude nesua as well. For Rabbi Akiva, now Rabbi Akiva says, Ahani gzeira shava l'mute pnuya. I agree that there's a gzeira shava to exclude a pnuya. V'ahani bas ubas l'rabos and but there's also the drasha from ubas that includes an asua. What was Rabbi Yishmael saying to Rabbi Akiva? Rabbi Yishmael thought, midikamer le bas ubas, that what he thought Rabbi Akiva meant, that he's making this drasha bas ubas, shmami no hadar beim gzeira shava. So doesn't that show that we're retracting completely, we're totally not using the gzeira shava, and that's why Rabbi Yishmael said to Rabbi Akiva, well, if you're making that drasha and you're getting rid of the gzeira shava, you should have included a pnuya as well. And the Gemara continues, Rabbi Yishmael, hi bas ubas, my darish beina Rabbi Yishmael, what does he do with this drasha of ubas? Mi boy, he needs it for the following, l'chidetani avui de Shmuel bar Avin, it's what the father of Shmuel bar Avin taught, l'fi shamatzino shachilek hakasa bezacharim, because we find by Kohanim, when we're talking about male Kohanim, there's a distinction, bein tamimim l'bali mumin, there's a distinction between a Kohen who is tam, who does not have any blemishes, and a Kohen who's a Baal Mum who has a blemish. A Kohen who's a Baal Mum doesn't serve in the Beis HaMikdash. So Yachol Nachlok Bivno Sayens, I might think also the daughter of a Kohen with a Mum. Maybe this doesn't apply. In other words, maybe it wouldn't apply. Let's say this Bas Kohen who committed the adultery, maybe she was the daughter of a Kohen with a Mum, and we shouldn't say that she gets Sreifa. Maybe we make that distinction. Tamalomer Bas Ubas. That's what the Pasuk says when it says Ubas. We include the daughter even of a Baal Mum Kohen. For Rabbi Akiva, now Rabbi Akiva says to that, Mivaheim makrivim v'hayu kodesh nafka. It says that they're v'hayu kodesh, that they are holy, and that means to say that even the Balei Mumin have that kedusha. But the Gemara continues. Now, what about Rabbi Yishmael? Rabbi Yishmael responds as far as v'hayu kodesh. If I just had that pasuk, havamina hanimiliinu, I would say that hanimiliinu. I would say that applies only to the Kohanim themselves, that they're considered to have that kedusha. Avol beno sayin lo, but who says their daughters? Maybe their daughters not. Kamash malon. So that's what it's teaching us. That again, the pasuk needs to tell us that this applies to the daughters as well. Rabbi Yishmael, and with regards to Rabbi Yishmael. And Rashi over here explains, Bein Tamimim LeBalei Mumin LeInyan Avoda. Again, serving in the Beis HaMikdash, there's a difference between Tamimim and Balei Mumin. So Yachal Af Ben Nos Balei Mumin Yotzu Mechlal Kedushasan V'Yadinam Kibnos Yisrael. I might have thought that also the daughters of Kohanim who have a mum, maybe they should be like regular Bnos Yisrael, not like Bas Kohen. Im Zanu if they commit adultery. V'hayu kodesh, it says in the pasuk, V'hayu kodesh, l'rabos af balei mumin l'kedusha. That's what Rabbi Akiva says. V'hayu kodesh says, no, even balei mumin have that kedusha. Rabbi Shmuel responds, if we only had that, hani mili denafki, shaf balei mumin b'kedushasan mi v'hayu kodesh, inu hakohanim atzmon nisrabu l'kedusha. Then I would have thought, no, just the kohanim themselves, they have that kedusha. Shalotomar hola psulin la'avoda yu mutarin l'tami l'mesim. Because maybe you would think if they can't do the avoda in the Beis HaMikdash, maybe they're allowed to become tamei to a mace, to a dead body. So we say, no, they have their kedusha, but I wouldn't necessarily know that that's true with the daughters. And then the Gemara said, Rabbi Yishmael, the nafkale b'mamatzino v'lo itzrach gzeira shaveh. Now, according to Rabbi Yishmael, who learns this mamatzino, and he doesn't require the gzeira shaveh, meaning Rabbi Yishmael does not use the gzeira shaveh of avia like Rabbi Akiva does. So what does he do with avia? And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Nun Beis Amud Aleph.